Chapter 1. The Abandoned Asylum. The Briarwood Asylum stood in eerie silence, its once grand architecture now swallowed by decay. The building loomed against the sky like a skeleton of forgotten horrors, its brick walls cracked, its windows shattered. The iron gate, twisted and rusted with time, creaked slightly as the wind passed through, as if whispering warnings to those who dared to enter. Eleanor Carter had read about this place in old newspaper clippings and hospital records. Accounts of malpractice, unexplained disappearances, and violent outbursts among patients and staff alike. The asylum had been abandoned in the 1950s, its history sealed away in classified documents, but rumors still circulated about the tormented souls that refused to leave. As she pushed the heavy front door open, a deep groan echoed through the entrance hall. The air inside was thick with dust, and the remnants of past lives were frozen in time. Wheelchairs rusted in corners, gurneys toppled, and patient files scattered across the marble floor. Her flashlight beam flickered against the peeling wallpaper, illuminating eerie scrawls carved into the walls. "They hear us, no escape, and we are still here." Eleanor swallowed hard, gripping her camera. She had expected a dilapidated ruin, but the atmosphere felt charged, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting. She took a step forward, her foot crunching on broken glass. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the vast emptiness. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely distinguishable, drifting from the end of the hallway. Her heart pounded as she turned her flashlight toward the source. The long corridor stretched before her, doors slightly ajar on either side, darkness seeping out like ink. Another whisper, closer this time. She wasn't alone. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Walls. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, her breath shallow. The whispering had stopped, but the oppressive silence was even worse. She aimed her flashlight down the hall, its weak glow flickering against the cracked paint and warped wooden doors. The corridor felt endless, stretching into darkness like a tunnel into oblivion. Her heart pounded as she reached the first door. The nameplate, tarnished and barely legible, read Dr. Wallace T. Graves, Chief Psychiatrist. The door was slightly ajar, and a foul stench drifted from within. A mix of mold, decay, and something disturbingly metallic. She pushed the door open wider and gasped. The office was in disarray, covered in layers of dust and forgotten records. But on the far wall, a message had been scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "They never left." Eleanor swallowed hard, lifting her camera and snapping a picture. The flash momentarily illuminated the room, and for a split second, she thought she saw movement in the reflection of the dusty glass cabinets. She spun around, but the room was empty. Then came another whisper, barely more than a breath against her ear. "Leave. Now." Her stomach lurched as she stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking. The voice had been right beside her, too close to have come from anywhere else in the room, but there was no one there. A loud bang echoed down the hallway. Eleanor froze, gripping her camera tightly. It had come from deeper inside the asylum. She wasn't alone, and whatever was here did not want her to stay. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Patients. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying her nerves as she pushed forward. The asylum's air grew colder the deeper she ventured, a sharp contrast to the summer night outside. She walked carefully through the dimly lit hallway, her flashlight revealing more remnants of the past, rusting beds, overturned chairs, and scattered medical charts bearing names that had long been forgotten. One particular file caught her attention, lying open on a decaying wooden table. The name Margaret Holloway was scribbled across the top in faded ink. Eleanor flipped through the brittle pages, scanning patient notes that detailed severe night terrors, constant screaming, and an unexplained paranoia that the walls were watching her. The final entry was hastily written. Patient claims to hear voices telling her to hide, found unresponsive this morning. Eyes open, mouth frozen in silent terror. Cause unknown. A chill crept up Eleanor's spine. She raised her camera and snapped a picture of the file before stepping back into the corridor. The whispers had stopped, but an overwhelming feeling of being observed settled over her. Something about this place felt wrong, as if time itself had warped inside these walls. Her footfalls echoed unnaturally as she turned a corner, coming face to face with a long row of cell-like rooms. The heavy steel doors bore small barred windows, and some were still locked, rusted shut. But others stood ajar, revealing tiny rooms with peeling paint, worn mattresses, and deep scratches along the walls. Some forming words, others just desperate, mindless carvings. Eleanor peered into one of the open cells. A single chair sat in the corner, its legs bolted to the floor. Straps dangled loosely from the armrests. The bed, nothing more than a metal frame, had what looked like old fingernail marks embedded into its surface. She felt an unshakable sadness in the air, as though the patient's pain still lingered, imprinted into the very foundation of Briarwood. Then, from further down the hall, came the sound of shuffling footsteps. Eleanor froze. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she slowly turned her flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on a shadow moving just beyond the doorway at the end of the hall. It was not the wind, it was not a trick of the light. Someone was there. She held her breath, waiting, and then the door at the end of the hall slammed shut on its own. Chapter 4. The Locked Ward. Eleanor hesitated before the heavy iron door marked Ward C, restricted access. The thick layer of dust covering the rusted handle suggested it hadn't been touched in years, yet something about it felt off. The other doors had been left ajar, their hinges barely clinging to the rotted wood, but this one was different. It remained sealed, as if protecting the world from whatever lay beyond. She reached for the handle, hesitating as a chill crept up her arm. With a deep breath, she pushed. The door resisted at first, groaning under years of neglect before finally yielding with a sharp creak. The air that rushed out was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Something rotten. The hallway beyond was darker than the rest of the asylum. Her flashlight barely pierced the shadows as she stepped forward. The walls were lined with metal doors, their tiny barred windows offering only glimpses of the decay within. Shackles lay on the floor, rusted chains still connected to the walls. Whatever had happened in this ward, it was clear that these patients had been kept under extreme confinement. Eleanor raised her camera, snapping pictures of the grim surroundings. As the flash went off, something caught her eye: movement. She lowered the camera instantly, heart hammering. For a split second, she could have sworn she saw fingers retreating into one of the cells. Swallowing hard, she stepped closer to the nearest door. The nameplate was corroded, but she could still make out the name: Edwin Vale. Her research had mentioned him, one of the asylum's most infamous patients. He had been admitted after allegedly murdering his entire family, claiming they had been taken over by something inhuman. His records stated that he had spent years in total isolation, speaking only in whispers, scratching strange symbols into the walls. Eleanor hesitated, then lifted onto her toes to peek inside the cell. Her flashlight revealed a tiny, windowless room, the mattress torn apart, its stuffing spilling onto the floor. The walls were covered in those very same symbols, sketched deep into the stone. But there was something else too. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. A fresh set of footprints led from the cot to the door, as if someone had just been standing there. A whisper curled through the air, so faint it could have been the wind. "Let me out." Eleanor stumbled back, her pulse racing. The door beside her suddenly rattled violently, the sound of unseen hands pounding from the inside. A deep, guttural scream erupted from within, shaking the walls. She turned and ran, the heavy door toward C slamming shut behind her with a deafening bang. Chapter 5. Shadows in the hallways. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The hallway before her stretched on, a seemingly endless corridor of darkness and decay. The dim beam of her flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, wavering shadows that flickered as if alive. The silence was thick, oppressive, but she knew she wasn't alone. She forced herself to move, each footstep deliberate, careful to avoid the debris scattered across the floor. The abandoned asylum groaned around her, as though shifting with unseen weight. The deeper she went, the colder the air became, wrapping around her like a living thing. A sound, soft and subtle, drifted through the air. A faint rustling, as if someone or something was moving just beyond the edge of her light. Eleanor tightened her grip on her camera. She turned a corner, raising the lens to snap a picture of the empty hallway ahead. The flash illuminated the space for a brief second, and then a shadow moved. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The darkness had shifted, as though something had been standing just beyond her vision, watching, waiting. Her pulse spiked. Then a whisper, closer than before. "He's coming." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it sent an icy spike of fear down Eleanor's spine. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping over the walls, the crumbling ceiling, the floor covered in decades of dust. No one was there. A loud creak sounded from above. She looked up just in time to see a shadow dart across the ceiling, impossibly fast, disappearing into the vents. Her breath hitched in her throat. Something was hunting her. She turned and ran, the shadows twisting and shifting in the corners of her vision. the hallway stretching endlessly before her as if the asylum itself was shifting, leading her deeper into its grasp. Chapter 6. The Hidden Journal. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the old leather-bound journal resting on a dust-covered desk. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed with age, yet the ink remained disturbingly fresh. She flipped it open, her breath catching as she scanned the hurried handwriting that filled each page. The first entries were methodical, written by a doctor chronicling patient progress, new treatments, and administrative notes. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew erratic, descending into frantic scrawls. The name at the top of each page was the same. Dr. Wallace T. Graves, the chief psychiatrist whose nameplate she had seen earlier. One passage made her blood run cold. They whisper to me at night, the ones we locked away, the ones we tried to forget, but they do not forget. They call my name. They tell me secrets no man should know. Eleanor swallowed hard, turning another page. The words became less structured, ink smeared as if written by shaking hands. The shadows move when I am not looking. They are not shadows at all. The patients were right. We never cured them. We only made them listen more closely. Her breath hitched as she realized the journal did not belong to a doctor documenting patient cases. This was the diary of a man losing his own mind. A loose page fell from the back of the book, fluttering to the floor. Eleanor knelt to pick it up and saw a crude map drawn in red ink. It showed the asylum's lower levels, places not found on any official blueprints she had seen. One area was circled, with a single word scribbled beneath it: below. The room around her suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. A distant creak echoed through the asylum, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the hall. Eleanor snapped the journal shut, her heart pounding as she realized someone else knew she had found it. Chapter 7. The Experiment Room. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the rusted door handle of a room that had been left off every blueprint she had seen. A sense of unease curled around her, tightening its grip as she pushed the door open with an unsettling creak. The air inside was thick, stale, and carried a metallic tang, like blood that had dried long ago. The room was unlike the others. Instead of patient cots or administration desks, metal tables lined the walls, their surfaces covered in dark stains. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered, their blades dulled with age but still menacing under the weak glow of her flashlight. Straps hung from each table, some still buckled, others hanging loose as if someone had struggled against them. Eleanor's stomach churned as she approached the nearest table. A brittle medical chart lay open, its pages yellowed with time. Scanning the records, she saw a list of names, followed by treatments marked with cold clinical detachment. Subject: 9. Severe aggression. Treatment: electroshock therapy. Response: unsuccessful. Subject: 12-12. Persistent hallucinations. Treatment: induced coma. Response: irreversible. The final entry was different. The ink was smudged, hurried, as though the writer had been in distress. Subject: 15. No longer human. Eleanor's breath hitched. The last recorded treatment had no notes on its outcome, but beneath it, a scrawl had been etched into the page, nearly tearing through the paper. "We should never have opened the door." She swallowed, shifting her gaze toward the far end of the room. A heavy steel door stood there, bolted shut with iron bars. Deep scratches marred its surface, long, jagged, and frenzied, as if something inside had been trying to claw its way out. And then she heard it, a faint thump from behind the door. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the sound came again, stronger this time, followed by a slow, dragging noise. Something was still in there. The air turned icy, her breath visible in the dim light. A whisper curled through the silence, not from her own mind, but from the walls themselves. "Let me out." The sound of metal groaning sent her heart into a panicked sprint. The bolts on the steel door shifted. On their own, Eleanor turned and ran, the whispering growing louder behind her, merging into agonized screams. She didn't stop until she was clear of the room, shoving the heavy door shut behind her. For a moment the asylum was silent once more. Then, from the other side of the door, something knocked. Chapter 8. The Echoes of Suffering. Eleanor's footsteps echoed as she moved through the abandoned asylum's lower corridors. These walls held the weight of something unseen: pain, terror, and unfinished stories. The deeper she ventured, the more the air thickened, pressing against her chest like an invisible hand. Her flashlight flickered, its weak beam barely illuminating the crumbling walls and rusting medical carts left to decay. Then the whispers started again. They were different this time. Not soft warnings carried by the wind, but sharp, desperate voices overlapping each other. Pleas for help, cries of anguish, some in languages she could not understand, others in chilling clarity. "Please, make it stop. They took my name. We're still here." The voices spiraled into a crescendo, bouncing off the walls as if the very structure was screaming. Eleanor clutched her ears, trying to shut them out, but it was useless. The sound pressed in from all sides, 1,000 tortured souls crying out in agony. And then silence. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise. Eleanor opened her eyes, her pulse hammering in her ears. The hallway had changed. The walls, once cracked and aged, were now pristine, as if time had reversed itself. The air smelled sterile, fresh, yet something was horribly wrong. A gurney rolled past her on its own, the wheels screeching against the polished tile. Eleanor backed away, her heart pounding. This was not the asylum as she knew it. This was Briarwood as it had been before its downfall. The screams that once echoed through these halls were now the sounds of doctors' hurried footsteps, the soft weeping of patients left unattended, the hum of electric equipment preparing for another experiment. Then she saw them. Ghostly figures, translucent and flickering like candlelight, moved around her. Nurses in crisp white uniforms rushed to administer sedatives to thrashing patients. Doctors with cold, emotionless eyes scribbled notes onto clipboards as they observed the suffering before them. Patients strapped to beds writhed in torment as metal machines whirred ominously nearby. Eleanor's breath came in sharp gasps. She was seeing the past. A figure loomed at the end of the hallway, a tall man in a doctor's coat, his face obscured by shadow. He turned slowly, as if sensing her presence, and though she couldn't see his features, she felt his gaze pierce through her. Dr. Wallace T. Graves, the man whose journal she had found, the man who had chronicled his descent into madness, the man who had done something unspeakable in these walls. A single phrase escaped his lips, sending a shudder through Eleanor's very bones. "You should not have come." Then everything collapsed. The asylum as she had seen it, the clean walls, the doctors, the patients, vanished in an instant. The building rotted before her eyes, returning to the ruin she had first stepped into. But the echoes of suffering still lingered. A single deafening scream erupted from the walls themselves, shaking the ground beneath her feet. The floor cracked. The ceiling groaned, and Eleanor fell into the darkness below. Chapter 9. The Cursed Doctor. Eleanor's hands trembled as she flipped through the last pages of Dr. Wallace T. Graves' journal. The doctor had once been a respected figure, a man of science, but the entries told a different story, one of obsession, desperation, and ultimately madness. He spoke of voices in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and an entity he had unknowingly awakened through his experiments on the patients of Briarwood. She scanned the dimly lit hallway, its walls etched with the same symbols she had seen scribbled in the margins of the journal. They pulsed faintly under her flashlight's glow, as if responding to her presence. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken warning. She stepped cautiously toward the abandoned office where Graves had spent his final days. The door, still bearing his nameplate, was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Eleanor was met with a scene frozen in time. The doctor's desk was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and a single chair lay broken in the corner. But it was what hung above the desk that made her blood run cold. A portrait, covered in grime, yet unmistakable. The face staring back at her was Dr. Graves, his expression hollow, his eyes sunken and blackened as if the very life had been drained from them. A whisper slid through the stale air. "You should not have come." Eleanor spun around, her flashlight flickering. The temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows stretched unnaturally, converging in the farthest corner. And then, emerging from the darkness, a figure appeared. A man in a torn lab coat, his body gaunt, his features barely human. It was him. Dr. Graves. His lips moved, but no sound came. Instead, the walls around her began to shake, the whispers growing into a deafening cacophony of tormented voices. Eleanor took a step back, but the doctor reached out a skeletal hand, his fingers twitching as if struggling against an unseen force. "I tried to stop it," he finally rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's still here. It's always been here." Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. The journal had spoken of ritual, an attempt to contain whatever had taken root in Briarwood. But Graves had failed. The entity had taken him instead. With a sudden, violent jolt, the doctor lunged forward, his presence distorting the air around him. Eleanor barely had time to react as the room collapsed into darkness. Chapter 10. The Silent Screams. Eleanor gasped as she was plunged into utter darkness. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, pressing in from all sides. A ringing filled her ears, disorienting her, and for a moment she thought she had gone deaf. Then she heard it, the distant, gut-wrenching sound of someone screaming. No, not someone, many people. The wails echoed through the corridors, twisting and blending together in an agonizing symphony of pain. Eleanor reached for her flashlight, her fingers fumbling as she clicked it back on. The beam was weak, flickering like a dying candle, but what it revealed made her stomach lurch. The walls, once cracked and crumbling, were now pulsing, almost as if they were alive. Shadowy figures twisted within them, trapped behind the surface like distorted reflections in warped glass. Their faces were twisted in silent agony, their mouths open in screams that could not be heard, only felt. Eleanor backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. A deep, guttural voice resonated from somewhere within the walls, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. "You see them now." She whirled around, her flashlight catching something at the end of the hall. A figure stood there, motionless, watching. It was human-shaped but wrong, its limbs slightly too long, its head tilted unnaturally. The shadows seemed to cling to it, shifting like smoke. A cold sweat broke across Eleanor's skin. The entity did not move, but she could feel its stare piercing through her, suffocating her with its presence. Then, as if responding to her fear, the screaming in the walls grew louder. Eleanor clamped her hands over her ears, the sound unbearable. It wasn't just the cries of the trapped. It was as if the very foundation of Briarwood itself was howling in torment. The floor trembled beneath her feet, dust raining from the ceiling. She turned, running blindly through the darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the faces pressing outward, reaching for her, their ghostly hands clawing at the air just inches from her skin. A doorway appeared ahead, an old wooden frame barely holding together. She lunged for it, shoving it open and slamming it behind her. The screams instantly stopped. The silence was deafening. Eleanor collapsed against the door, her chest rising and falling in frantic gasps. The room she had entered was small, untouched by time. A single cot sat in the corner, and on it, a tattered straitjacket lay folded neatly. But it was the nameplate above the cot that made her blood freeze. Patient 15 by Wallace T. Graves. Dr. Graves had not just experimented on others. He had been a patient himself. The realization struck her like a hammer. The doctor had lost control of the entity. It had taken him, just as it had taken so many others. And now, it was coming for her. A low growl echoed through the room, reverberating through the walls. The door behind her rattled violently, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. Eleanor grabbed the straitjacket, clutching it like a lifeline. A scrap of paper fell from one of its sleeves, fluttering to the floor. She picked it up, her hands shaking as she read the frantic handwriting. The only way to stop it is below. She had no choice. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to end this, she had to go deeper. She had to find what lay beneath Briarwood. Chapter 11. The vanishing door. Eleanor clutched the straitjacket tightly as the pounding on the door behind her grew more frantic. The growl had turned into a guttural shriek, something not human rattling against the fragile wood. Her breath came in short gasps as she fumbled for her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the small room for any way out. Then she saw it. At the far end of the room, past the cot and rusting bed frame, a door stood slightly ajar. A faint glow pulsed from the space beyond it. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran for it, shoving it open and stepping into the unknown. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the light blinked out. She turned in panic. The doorway was gone. Not closed, gone. The room she had just left, the screaming, the pounding on the wood, had vanished. She was no longer in the asylum's patient quarters. The walls around her were rough stone, damp and cold beneath her fingertips. The air smelled of earth and rot, of something long buried beneath Briarwood's foundations. Her flashlight flickered, casting jittering shadows across the cavernous space. She had descended somewhere without even realizing it, deeper into the asylum's hidden levels. The journal had hinted at underground passages, forgotten by time, but who had used them? And why? A scraping noise made her heart seize in her chest. She wasn't alone. The sound was slow, deliberate, a dragging movement, echoing through the cavern. Eleanor gripped her flashlight like a weapon, inching forward. The tunnel before her twisted unnaturally, as if the very walls had warped over time. Symbols, the same ones from the journal, were etched into the stone, glowing faintly like embers in the darkness. She reached out, tracing a symbol with her fingers. The moment she did, the temperature plunged. A new doorway appeared ahead, not made of wood or stone, but shadows. It pulsed, shifting as if alive. Eleanor took a shaky step toward it. If she turned back now, she would never know the truth. Never know if she could stop whatever haunted Briarwood. She exhaled sharply, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Then, without another thought, she stepped through. Chapter 12. The Horrors Below. Eleanor's breath hitched as she stepped through the shifting doorway, the darkness swallowing her whole. The temperature plummeted, her breath fogging before her as she descended deeper into the forgotten tunnels beneath Briarwood. The walls here were different. No longer crumbling brick and plaster, but ancient stone, damp and lined with deep carvings. Symbols pulsed faintly, their shapes eerily similar to the ones she had seen in Graves' journal. The tunnels were vast, stretching into endless black corridors. The air carried an unnatural stillness, yet she felt a presence, something unseen, watching. Her flashlight's beam flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. Then came the whispers. Not the desperate voices of the asylum's tortured spirits, but something older, something inhuman. The sound slithered along the walls, curling around her like unseen fingers. Eleanor clutched the straitjacket tighter, the note's warning echoing in her mind. The only way to stop it is below. A distant scraping sound sent shivers down her spine. It was followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Eleanor spun around, her flashlight landing on a tunnel branching off to the left. The footprints in the dust were fresh. Too fresh. She wasn't alone down here. She moved forward cautiously, her own footsteps muffled by the dampness of the floor. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, lined with rusted gurneys and shattered medical equipment. In the center stood a single operating table, restraints still attached, stained dark with something old and rotten. Then, from the shadows, it moved. A shape and tall, twisted, unnatural lurched into view. It had no eyes, but its presence burned into Eleanor's skin like fire. Its body was wrapped in decayed hospital linens, and its elongated fingers twitched as it took a slow step toward her. She recognized it. Or rather, she recognized what it used to be. Dr. Graves. His body, or what remained of it, was no longer human. His flesh was stretched, grotesque and bound by whatever force had claimed him. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no words came, only the wailing echoes of the damned rising from the walls around them. Eleanor stumbled back as he lunged, his movement impossibly fast. She barely had time to react before she collided with something solid. The chamber shuddered, the symbols in the stone pulsing violently. The tunnel was collapsing. The whispers became deafening. She had found the source of Briarwood's curse, and it had found her. Chapter 13. The Final Patient. Eleanor's vision blurred as she staggered backward, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The monstrous form of Dr. Graves loomed before her, its twisted frame writhing like a puppet controlled by unseen hands. The shadows clung to him, stretching, merging with his very being, as if he were more specter than man. His mouth opened in a silent wail, and the walls trembled in response. Symbols burned to life around them, flickering like dying embers. Eleanor forced herself to move, stumbling toward the tunnel's only exit, a narrow passage at the far end, its entrance obscured by jagged stone. She could hear the scraping of Graves' elongated fingers against the floor as he followed, his steps uneven, his form flickering between this world and something far more ancient. Eleanor reached the passage, her fingers scraping against damp rock as she pushed forward, but as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. The tunnel wasn't empty. Lining both sides were iron-barred cells, their doors rusted but still locked tight, and inside, figures, patients. Some sat hunched, their backs to her. Others lay on the floor, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Their faces were obscured in shadow, but Eleanor felt their presence, their suffering. These weren't echoes like before. These were the lost, the last of Briarwood's patients. A single voice, fragile and hoarse, broke the silence. "Help us!" Eleanor gasped, stepping closer. One of the figures shifted, revealing a skeletal face, its eyes sunken but still filled with something human. He wasn't a ghost, not entirely. He had been trapped in this place for decades. "Please," the voice rasped again. "Don't let him take us." A deafening shriek ripped through the tunnel as Graves lunged forward, the shadows exploding around him. The patients recoiled, their bodies flickering as if caught between realities. Eleanor had seconds to react. She reached into her bag, pulling out the tattered straitjacket from Graves' former cell. The note had said the only way to stop it was below. But it wasn't just a direction, it was a method. The straitjacket was the key. She lunged, throwing it forward. The moment the fabric touched Graves' form, the entire tunnel shook. The shadows shrieked, recoiling as if burned. Graves convulsed, his body twisting in on itself as the symbols in the walls ignited, burning with a blinding white light. The final patient, the real Graves, let out one last agonized whisper, and then the darkness swallowed him whole. The asylum's walls began to collapse. Eleanor turned to the figures in the cells, her breath ragged. The last of the trapped patients stared at her, their forms flickering. The curse had been broken, but time had already claimed them. One by one, they faded, leaving only their whispered gratitude in the air. Chapter 14. Breaking the Curse. The walls of Briarwood trembled violently as the last of the cursed energy was expelled from its foundations. Eleanor clutched the rough stone for support, her heart pounding as the echoes of the long-suffering patients faded into silence. The asylum, once a prison of torment, now felt emptier, yet the weight of its history still lingered in the air. She turned back toward the chamber where she had banished Dr. Graves. The tattered remains of the straitjacket lay at the center, surrounded by symbols that had once pulsed with eerie energy, now nothing more than dull carvings in the ancient stone. The curse had been severed, but at what cost? A deep rumbling echoed from beneath her feet, and Eleanor knew she had seconds to escape. The very ground beneath Briarwood was giving way, as if the asylum itself sought to bury its horrors forever. With a final glance at the remnants of the past, she turned and ran. The tunnels twisted and buckled as she sprinted through them, dodging falling debris and choking on the dust of collapsing stone. The once distant exit now felt impossibly far, but she pushed forward, driven by the sheer force of survival. The asylum was crumbling, the ancient corridors consumed by the darkness they had hidden for centuries. She reached the final passage, the entrance to the asylum's underground depths barely visible through the shifting rubble. A massive crack split the ceiling, and daylight poured through, a beacon of hope in a place devoid of it for too long. With one last desperate leap, Eleanor hurled herself through the opening, just as the tunnels collapsed behind her. Gasping for air, she lay on the cold, cracked pavement outside the asylum's main building, the first rays of morning stretching across the sky. Briarwood stood before her, its towering frame now fractured and sinking into the ground. The whispers had ceased. The darkness was gone. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt free. Yet, as she rose to her feet, a lingering unease crept into her mind. Briarwood's horrors had been buried, but history had a way of repeating itself. She knew someone, someday, would come searching just as she had. And when they did, they would find what still lurked beneath. Chapter 15. What Lurks in the Shadows. Eleanor stood at the edge of Briarwood's ruins, the morning sun painting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The asylum had fallen, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, something that had escaped the collapse, something that still lingered in the spaces where light refused to reach. She turned back toward the rubble, the gaping hole where the underground tunnels had caved in. A cold wind stirred the debris, lifting specks of dust into the air. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the journal she had recovered from Graves' office, the only evidence of what had transpired within Briarwood's walls. Then she heard it, a whisper, not from behind her, not from the ruins, but from within the journal itself. Eleanor's breath hitched. The pages fluttered as if touched by unseen hands, flipping rapidly before settling on an entry she had not yet read. The ink, once faded, now appeared fresh, glistening as if it had just been written. "It doesn't end here. It never does. The hollow takes, but it never rests. If you listen closely, you will hear it too." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The hollow. The name had appeared throughout the asylum's history, whispered in the margins of records, scrawled onto walls, etched into the very foundation of Briarwood itself. But she had assumed it referred to the darkness within those walls, to the curse that had claimed so many lives. What if she was wrong? The wind picked up again, colder this time. The shadows at her feet shifted, not the way shadows should move in the morning light, but with purpose, with hunger. Eleanor took a slow step back, her pulse quickening. The journal trembled in her hands, as if urging her to run, but where? The asylum was gone, yet its horrors were not. Something had survived. She turned sharply, striding away from the ruins, forcing herself not to look back. The further she walked, the heavier the air became, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. And then, just as she reached the tree line, she heard her own voice whisper from the journal's pages. "You should not have come." A shadow stretched ahead of her, long and unnatural. Something had followed her from Briarwood. Something had escaped.